All right, we're moving on to Sub-Saharan Africa now, and then clearly by the name, by saying Sub-Saharan, it's below the Saharan Desert. The Saharan Desert, we'll talk about that later, makes a nice transition and kind of a barrier between a lot of the North-South movement in here. So we see much different cultural and political evolutions in this area versus this in the southern part of Africa. With Africa, medical issues will always be kind of back in the background fighting diseases. There's multiple reasons for this going on, on top of the poverty. They've got a high population growth rate. They've got a rural population where it's always difficult to get services to those areas. And then the resultant issue of the high disease rate for multiple diseases. Just real quick, the coronavirus hasn't really taken hold in Africa yet. It's there, but it's not spread very quickly. At the time I said this, so that could have changed dramatically by the time you're viewing this video. So I'll kind of just minimize the coronavirus simply because there's no valid data to talk to you about. Notice too, when you're dealing with issues in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have this large population that is 20 years old or less. And when you've got kids that are under age 10, you have to feed them, provide services for them. They're not supposed to be working. So there's other issues on top of the other poverty issues that have to be addressed. So one of the reasons we see these diseases spread through so quickly through Africa is by and large part just nutritional deficiencies. The better fed you are, the greater variety of vitamins and minerals you get into your system, the better able you are to fight off diseases. And that's just simply not prevalent throughout these rural areas. There's a lack of education, simple things as far as how viruses are spread or how diseases are spread. Ignorance about what could happen if you do something. Simple things like making sure that the groundwater table doesn't intersect your local latrine, and so you're polluting your own water source, which leads to cholera and other diseases. The climate, I know that sounds weird, but the climate is conducive to flying insects, which are vectors that carry diseases. So we've got multiple diseases, and I'm not even mentioning coronavirus in here, where you've got millions suffering from it, tens of thousands, if not more, dying from it. And so these are huge, huge issues facing Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I'll focus just on two, because we could get bogged down in all the different diseases. But I'll focus on AIDS and sleeping sickness. So, wow, this is really hard to read. Hold on just a second. Okay, that's a little easier to read. When we're talking about diseases, everybody's talking about the coronavirus pandemic, but what does that mean? If you've got a localized disease that kind of exists in the background of a population where some people have an immunity to it, it's not usually, if it's an endemic disease, it's typically not life-threatening, but it's going to have negative consequences, maybe shorten your lifespan, maybe decrease the output. We'll talk about sleeping sickness as being an endemic disease. If you've got an outbreak, say, of mononucleosis at a local high school, that would be considered an endemic disease. Epidemic, when it's typically an increase in area that it's covered and also severity of the disease. But again, this would be at a local or regional scale. So if you had the measles outbreak we had in California a couple of years ago because some idiot went to Disneyland with the measles and wasn't vaccinated, that would be an epidemic. And even at that the measles one wasn't that bad of one. It had the potential to get much more widespread. Now, pandemic is what we're seeing now with the coronavirus. It's a worldwide spread of a disease and worldwide consequences for a disease. These don't happen very often, obviously. The last major flu outbreak that was global would be comparing to, say, the Spanish flu of 1918, what we're seeing now. So all of these have greater impacts in Sub-Saharan Africa just because of their medical conditions, their poverty, their lack of ability to treat them. So the impacts seem to always be greater there. For example, the endemic disease that is spread from humans or through to humans is the sleeping sickness. And it's spread by this nasty little bastard down here, the tsetse fly. It's actually really big, maybe like the size of a horsefly that we would see here in the States. And what they carry the disease, both the cattle and to humans. When we were in Tanzania, when we were in Tanzania, I got bit by one, and oh my God, did it hurt. It bit me right on the spine and it stung like heck. But fortunately, there was no incidences of sleeping sickness in this area. They were watching for it, but there was nothing to be transmitted to humans. The cattle get a deadly disease called Nagana. And if you've got a rural population and a pastoral population like there exists in many parts of Africa, the cattle are your income, the cattle are your wealth. And if the disease is wiping out that, it causes, greater society breakdowns. If your monetary unit, the cow, or your symbol of wealth, the cow, are dying from a disease. Now, the Ebola one, I'm not worried about Ebola simply because, in fact, I'm not even going to test you on Ebola. But everybody panics about Ebola, like, oh my God, what happens if Ebola gets worldwide? But why it's not a threat worldwide is that you die really quickly from it. And so it limits your ability to transport it to other areas. People who picked up the disease their last day in Africa develop symptoms on the plane to where they're going to. The couple of incidences that happened the last couple of years. So I know that's a terrible thing to say, but it's what keeps it from spreading to other areas. And if we're talking about cause of death in Africa, really Ebola is so tiny compared with the other issues that are going on there. The HIV/AIDS is just, that's the one that's staggering. When you're well over 500,000 people, the top 3-4 diseases all in the hundreds of thousands, that's what's frightening. And we'll just let that one go. So since AIDS is the big issue in Africa, killing 600,000 people, this is their big issue. This is their disease that they have to deal with. When you look at how it's spread globally, clearly it's disproportionate in Africa. It varies depending on who's doing the measurements, but you've got some countries that are over 50% of the adult population has AIDS. And why? It's multiple reasons. That I keep saying multiple reasons or multiple causes. It's because what's happening in Africa with poverty and with diseases and with AIDS is there's not one single problem or single cause. It's a convergence of multiple issues all at once. Again, the poorly educated population means they just don't know how AIDS is spread. They don't get the typical information, pamphlets, and education about preventing sexual transmitted diseases that our population gets. There's myths that it was made up by the West. Having sex with a virgin will cure you. It only makes things worse. And why you see the priest and death down in the lower left-hand corner is that the Catholic Church is getting a lot of flack for their position on the use of condoms, and they're still forbidding it. And condoms are one of the easiest way to stop the spread of any sexually transmitted disease. But they're not allowing the population to be using them, or they're discouraging the Catholics from using them. They're in an indirect way to blame for many of the deaths that are happening in the Catholic countries in Africa. And then you've got fake cures. You had one of the presidents who was saying he had the cure for AIDS, and so the population was like, "Oh, we don't have to worry about it anymore." And it's just was a brief reprieve from the symptoms, but it was by no means a cure. But he's the president, and so presidents of countries don't lie, do they? Why is it so common? I mentioned that limited access and use of condoms. The cultural issues, this comes into play a lot because there's other countries that have low literacy rates and limited access to condoms and not these other problems. You have a very transient population. They move from job to job, farming throughout the area. Maybe there's a construction job somewhere. So people will move over large distances, predominantly men, for long distances to find work where it's available. So that combined with this, it's not really that the marriages condone sleeping with other people. It's just that it's kind of accepted that while the male is away, he may engage in sexual encounters outside of marriage, which that's again how you spread AIDS when you have multiple partners. There's attitudes towards female pleasure and sex that it seems to lead towards more rough sex, which increases the likelihood of the exchange of more bodily fluids between the two people. It's all of these. You can't just go in and pass out condoms because you've got other issues going on as well. Oh, look, I did it again. So the antiviral drugs, they're out there, but they're expensive. And most pharmaceutical companies aren't going to be selling them in Africa because they can't make a profit there. They're not a cure. They're just simply something that gets the symptoms to go into the background. Now, for the United States has been off and on in how we've provided aid to Africa, and it's dependent on the president typically. For a while, we were promoting abstinence. Let's face it, you can't get a sexually transmitted disease if you don't have sex. However, the abstinence education isn't always the best. In the United States, for example, high schoolers who receive an abstinence-only education have a higher birth rate than those get the full spectrum of sexual education. But other presidents have provided condoms along with the aid. I don't currently know what the U.S. position is on providing condoms to Africa, but that has been part of many recent packages to Africa. Now, the tuck shop in English-speaking parts of Sub-Saharan Africa would be like your local 7-Eleven. It's kind of a catch-all. They have a little bit of everything. So you're not going to get big chain stores. So a tuck shop is just kind of a little bit of everything. Well, unfortunately, the death rates are so high in these areas is the tuck shops are going to carry, supplies, food, candy bars, and coffins, just because they're in such high demand. Physical geography, I'm not going to be too excited about the plateaus. I do like the rivers. One of the reasons we didn't see a lot of European exploration into the interior of Africa until the 1800s, which is simply the Niger River here and the Congo River here are non-navigable. You only have to go a few miles inland on both before you hit rapids, so you can't take large boats up the rivers, which makes exploring deep in the interior difficult. The rift valleys in Eastern Africa, are also interesting because we find really a lot of evidence of the early hominid evolution, where humans came from. And in particular, I'll be showing some pictures later of this part of Tanzania at Olduvai Gorge. So if you're an anthropologist, you're going to get all excited. Climate-wise, oh my God, this is, again, another reason things are difficult. The climate, you've got desert, tropical savanna, steppe, all of which are difficult for food production. The tropical rainforest, you get too much rain. Obviously, the desert, you get too little rain. There's only a handful of areas that have good agricultural land, and they're in this part of South Africa. It doesn't show up well here, but parts of Kenya do have some okay agricultural land, but it's nothing to write home about. They did write home, and that's why there was white migrants who moved to South Africa. The other issue is even with these climate types, the way the weather patterns develop over the Atlantic Ocean are different than the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is larger. We tend to have more consistent weather patterns and climate patterns. The Atlantic is smaller, so we don't develop that consistency. So you may have 20 inches of rain one year, 1 inch of rain the next year, 1 inch of rain, and then 40 inches of rain. So there's a lot of variability. So it's difficult to carry seeds over from year to year, what crop is going to grow in one year versus the next, which is kind of compounding the food availability in these areas. We are seeing, sorry about that, we are seeing the impacts of global warming. I just wanted to introduce you to a new term and show how global warming affects different places differently. Now, Kilimanjaro has a glacier on top of it. It's one of the few global tropical glaciers, and it's almost gone. Um, but what's happening is typically in the past, the meltwater from the glaciers fed some of the villages along the base of Kilimanjaro. Well, Kilimanjaro isn't, the glacier isn't melting, it's sublimating. And sublimation is when the ice evaporates, it goes directly into a gas. And so notice there's no meltwater coming off of this. It's because when this is shrinking, it's just simply going up into the atmosphere. And that meltwater isn't making it down to those villages. And now they're suffering from a lack of water. So this is the Furtwängler, I can't pronounce that, 2008. And then a colleague of mine was there a few years ago. You can see how it shrank substantially since then. As you'd expect, for a less developed country, you've got a higher percentage of farmers in the population. And with the climate problems, most of it is just subsistence agriculture. We'll talk more about subsistence agriculture when we talk about Southeast Asia. But it's just simply providing enough food for yourself and your family from year to year. You're not producing a huge surplus that you can sell to make money from. You've got to save seeds that you can plant again the following year. If there was good land, let's face it, when the European colonizers came, they took it. And that left even more marginal lands for the indigenous population. The poor climates I already mentioned are not conducive to agriculture. So when you are farming, you tend to just simply overuse it. You'll overgraze, you'll overuse the soil. You'll overuse this. When you overuse the soil, you should be doing crop rotation so you can return nitrates and other minerals to the soil depending on what crops you plant. Or you have to let a field go fallow for a couple of years to allow it to return, the nutrients to return. They don't do that. It's a combination of lack of education, just not a luxury of saying, I'm not going to farm this field for a year. They need the food. I mentioned cattle as status, and what happens is that they too graze and overgraze the fields. And you want a lot of cows, it shows that you're wealthy, but maybe your field can't support that many cows. You'll find issues sometimes with cattle health, and notice that there's no grasses in this area because it's all been removed by the cattle. Cattle are not a good food source always, simply because they will take in 100 calories of plants to produce 10 calories of food for humans to consume. We'll see a contrast with cattle when we get to China, where the recognition of limited land and feeding large population means that cattle are a luxury and not a symbol of wealth. And the colonizers, they were looking for new territory. And we had, the water route to Asia, we wanted the slaves. But really what started to change in the 1800s as we had more European powers needing more resources that they couldn't get in Europe. The Belgians, for example, it's a small country, didn't have enough resources for their own industrial needs, so they went to Africa to get them. Also in the 1800s, you had these new European powers that they wanted their own colonies too. The Spanish got them, the French got them, the British got them, the Portuguese got them, but that was in the 17 and early 1800s. And now you had all these new European powers who wanted their own colonies. I know it sounds like it's a weird status symbol for a European power, but this was the Europe of the 1800s. Slave trade, most of the slaves went to South America, and they were from these coastal areas in through here. It was typically the coastal groups were raiding inland, and they would trade slaves for guns, and that would increase their influence in the internal areas. Well, the Europeans were so paranoid about accidentally fighting each other and starting a war, was that there were fears that as these colonial empires grew in Africa, they might end up fighting each other in Africa. So in 1884, they all went to Berlin and decided who was going to get what. Please note there was no African people there. It was all all the European powers deciding who was going to get what. So for example, the Germans were here and the Portuguese were here. So what they did is they just split the difference and drew this line across. But they wanted to make sure that the Germans had access to a water route, and so they put in this little narrow band called the Caprese Strip. So the 1800s drawing of this was just simply based on nothing about the local population. So you ended up splitting tribal groups. You ended up having tribal relations from one group to another just not allowed anymore because they were across an international boundary. And we still see some of those issues played out today because the boundaries we see in modern Africa correspond with what was done arbitrarily in Berlin in 1884. Now, as colonizers, each European power kind of had a different role they played. I don't expect you to know the difference between all of these. I think if I had to pick, I'd pick the British because the British system, what they called indirect rule, is they would take the local leadership, put them, kind of keep them in place, but put the British above the local leadership. And so when the British abandoned their colonies or were kicked out of their colonies, there was some type of power structure in place. The British were also big on education, so there was a lot of schools in the British colonies. The French thought everybody wanted to be French, which always makes me laugh. So you see, pictures of colonial Africans wearing berets and eating at a cafe because that's what the French thought they'd want them to be. The Portuguese and Belgians were bastards. It was just what could they do for money? What could they do to get the most out of Africa? So when they left or were kicked out, there was a huge power vacuum. And we saw those colonies go into complete disarray for years simply because nobody had been trained to run a country. Nobody had been trained to be doctors, engineers, because the Portuguese and Belgians looked down upon the Africans so much and considered them savages and incapable of self-rule. And just as there were Spanish colonial legacies in Latin America, we've got European colonial legacies in Africa. Because they were decolonized so late, mostly in the last 60 years or so, we don't have a lot of local industrial development in most African countries. So poverty is prevalent throughout Africa. The transportation facilities, most of it was just to bring things to the port. So that was all right, but there was not a lot of transportation networks set up between the African nations. And so sharing of goods like they do in Europe, trade across international boundaries is a little bit more difficult simply because they don't have good infrastructure from country to country. And if you're poor, it's something that's hard to build anyway. The Europeans also would focus on one thing that country could produce a lot of. And so Ivory Coast, for example, they could produce, if the climate was perfect, for cacao beans, which could be processed into chocolate. And so one of the world's leading exporters of cacao beans is Ivory Coast. Well, they're just exporting the bean, not the chocolate. And so where do you make the money? Is it growing the beans or making the chocolate? Some of the de facto languages in the country is that of the colonizer. So you'll find English common in former English colonies, German in former German colonies. It's not always the case, but you'll find some patterns related to that. And this is the one that always amazes me, that there's this tradition of the culture has evolved to authoritarian rules, that there's somebody going to tell you what to do and you just do it, whether it was the colonizer or the first dictator comes to power after that colonizer, and then the dictator who takes over from him. And so sometimes the concepts of democracy just don't exist in these places. And so when we come in and say, all right, we're going to have a democratic election, it just seems alien. And so it turns into this who can threaten the most people to vote for them or to not vote for the opposition, as opposed to a normal democratic process. Coffee, big export from this area. So like I said, that export-based economy is often not the most profitable way, and they're also subject to the whims of the international markets. If the United States is trying to dump a bunch of wheat because we've got a wheat surplus, that'll lower the price and then they can't compete on wheat. We subsidize our farmers, so typically our farm goods are relatively inexpensive worldwide. And so if you've got a labor-intensive farming in Africa versus a very cheap method of producing large amounts of food in the United States, it's difficult to compete with us. So you end up with the countries are in this cycle of aid. It's like, we need money to run the country. Where are we going to get it from? And they're dependent on the Europeans or Americans, and nowadays the Chinese as well. What we're starting to see outside of foreign intervention is microcredits. The idea that you do small loans rather than building a multi-billion-dollar port, which a country doesn't need, you do these small loans to villages or to individuals for a couple $100, a couple $1,000, and they need a water pump so they can get fresh water. And then now all of a sudden now they're farming, or they need a sewing machine so they can create their own little, clothing business. They have a relatively high return rate as well, but they have a lot of local impact that's desperately needed. So these are expanding. Now, some groups that are doing the credits are tying it to education. So we're going to come in and loan you money, but before we loan you money, we're going to watch a talk about how to reduce the spread of AIDS in your village, and then they'll loan them the money. Also, what we're seeing is a secondary effect that if you've got women with sewing businesses or these loans have allowed them to start their own businesses. We've talked about this before. Women in the workforce reduces the birth rate. So nobody's coming into these poor areas with high birth rates saying, hey, stop having kids. They're coming in saying, here's job opportunities for many people, including women, which we all know will reduce the birth rate. They just kind of leave that part out, but it's a secondary benefit. The term kleptocracy makes me laugh. And so you don't have to know the specifics of Zaire and Liberia, but the corruption in some areas is so bad that the government exists for its own profit, the profit of the individuals in charge. It's basically kleptocracy. If you're a kleptomaniac, you steal things. And so instead of a democracy, it's a kleptocracy. So you're stealing stuff. These people are squirreling away billions of dollars. Zaire, which is now Congo, they had diamonds, they had oil. They certainly weren't spending it on their population. Liberia squirreled away, Charles Taylor squirreled away millions of dollars as well. They're still finding money from both of these hidden in accounts around the world. There's multiple incidences of this happening in Africa. Also, I mentioned the diamonds in Congo now. The diamonds have huge international value. And so the last civil war in Zaire, when this group took over and renamed it Congo, that started in the diamond mining areas because they knew if they had diamonds, they could trade them or sell them and get weapons. So they're often referred to as blood diamonds, conflict diamonds, dirty diamonds. There's multiple names for them, depending on which agency is talking about them. So this was at its peak in the late 90s because there were civil wars going on in diamond areas. The diamond industry stepped in with some self-regulation. And if you've ever been shopping for diamonds, De Beers is the world's leading distributor of diamonds. And they've got to go out of their way to calm down people about blood diamonds because one time it was 40% of the market were blood diamonds. So, that diamond ring may have been farmed by some child who, if they didn't produce their diamond quota, would lose a finger. I mean, and I'm not being sarcastic. That's how brutal some of these regimes are in these local villages for diamond production because it meant so much money for them. So they have what they say they're tracing diamonds. They say that the diamond industry is cleaned up, that less than 5% of the diamonds are coming from these areas. But there's two things here. One, the diamond industry is self-regulating, so of course they're going to say it's better. The other thing is just it's a coincidence that we're not seeing civil wars in diamond areas. So, of course, there's going to be less on the market. Personally, I don't buy diamonds. When I a engagement ring for my wife, we weren't shopping for diamonds. Neither one of us believed in kind of fueling that industry in any way. It may have been a perfectly safe, non-conflict diamond from Canada, but as long as there's a demand for them, it's going to drive the price up and they're going to be used in this way. So no diamonds for me. This was a really bad movie, by the way. So the language patterns, there's the Niger-Kordofan family dominates. So you've got what seemingly was like one large language. It's a family of languages that are related, kind of like the Germanic languages are related to each other, but English and German aren't mutually intelligible. So within these, you typically have populations that are multilingual. So you're going to speak your local tribal language. You're going to speak the lingua franca, which is the common language of the entire government. So sometimes in this example, we've got a former British colony that has the official language of the government is English. You've got some where the official language is French or Spanish. Swahili exists in Eastern Africa. So you're going to speak the local language, you're going to speak the lingua franca, and you'll typically speak a form of pidgin as well. Now, pidgin languages they're not full languages, they're partial languages in order to allow people to communicate and to conduct business. So you're going to have elements of different languages. And so the pidgin may be a combination of local languages, the lingua franca, and the pidgin is going to vary from place to place. And so, sorry to back up real quick. So the pidgin is going to be slightly different as you move along the coast as these groups interact with different groups. And so they may be able to speak to everybody in this area using pidgin, but they can't speak to people in these areas using the pidgin language. In Southern Africa and South Africa, there's a pidgin that's kind of over a larger area. And so it's based on English. And so what you're seeing down here is pidgin English, where, sorry, true, that's a South African expression, no got work. So they're not hiring. And that's where you get that from. So you'll notice spelling is not that important in pidgin languages. I won't really talk much about religions, just what you would expect from colonial holdings, so don't worry about that. Now, when we go do part 2, we'll talk about some of the sub-regions of Sub-Saharan Africa and individual countries. And the individual countries, I want you to know, I will really call out and identify. There's 53 countries in Africa. I can't expect you to know them all, but I'll let you know which ones I want you to know where they are. All right, thank you.